I would like to welcome everybody to a further digital humanism lecture. And we are back to 5 p.m. because last week we started at 6 p.m. So welcome back. This time it's on geopolitics and technology. Last time it was on technology and progress and economics. This time we look at the geopolitical dimension of technology. And for this is a special welcome to the speaker of today, Henry Farrell from Johns Hopkins University, who is an expert also in this geopolitical dimension. He has written a lot about that, and we are really looking forward to this presentation. The moderator of today is Paul Timmers, who will then also introduce Henry in more details and giving some of his bios. Choreography is always 30 minutes talk and then 30 minutes Q&A moderated by Paul. And at the end, again, a piece of music. It's already a digital humanism tradition. And this time the piece of music is proposed by Henry, and we already spoke about it. Now, welcome to our moderator, Paul Timmers. I do not need to introduce him. He's well known to our community. And I think he's the right moderator for today with this geopolitical dimension. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hannes. It's a great honor for me to introduce Professor Farrell, Henry Farrell here. Your topic is really, I think, at the heart of what is concerning us at Digital Humanism. Henry Farrell is the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Professor of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins, the School of Advanced International Studies, and also the recipient of a prize that is handed out by the Technical University of Munich, the Friedrich Schiedel Prize for Politics and Technology. So politics and technology is something that interests us a lot. He's very well known amongst international relations scholars, political sciences, and his most recent book is Underground Empire. I'm sure that he will talk about that, How America Weaponized the World Economy. That's actually the title of the talk today, together with Abe Newman, recommended by many high-profile thinkers, academics, and others, and I think it's really worth a read. It's not only very, very interesting, it's also very, very readable, and I think that's kind of characteristic of how Henry Farrell writes about difficult topics that have to do with politics and international relations and technology. He has also written about privacy and power, the transatlantic relationships, and generally his article, for example, about weaponized interdependence is one of these landmark articles that has appeared in the field of political sciences and international relations. What is perhaps interesting for everybody to add to that is that he's also a very prolific writer on blogs, and very kind of enjoyable blogs. And one of his, I think actually the most recent blog is actually about a speaker that we had the previous time, Daron Acemoglu, and the book Power and Progress. And someone who had been criticizing that, and Professor Farrell goes into that criticism, and at the same time that is really enlightening to get his view on the work of Acemoglu and Johnson that we had actually in the last time presented here. He's Irish American, and that's a nice transatlantic combination that's very welcome in the digital humanism community. So without further ado, I turn over to Professor Farrell, and I think you have a presentation.
Wonderful, and I hope the presentation should now be visible, I believe.
It is.
Wonderful. So as you say, the presentation is going to build upon the arguments that Abraham Newman, my co-author, and I make in this book, Underground Empire, How America Weaponized the Global Economy, which I really recommend to you. Obviously, you should rush out and buy it. It is indeed a very readable book. One of the great things I think that I have really enjoyed getting as a compliment is when reviewers say that it reads like a thriller, which is something that academics were not supposed to write books that read like thrillers. But actually, if you steal the ways in which people who write techno thrillers write, steal the ways in which science fiction writers write, you begin to learn a lot of ways in which you can actually convey highly complex information to a non-specialist audience. And all of us, in a certain sense, are non-specialist audiences, because if you are in the digital humanities, or if you're in the kinds of digital social sciences that I am, we're all the time leaping into other people's fields and hoping that we don't break our necks by misunderstanding what is there. So it's a good book, and it has an argument, and I think it's an argument which is one which has really begun to help us to understand some of the aspects of what is happening in the global economy, and give us at least a path forward for understanding what some of the choices are that we face in the future. And I should say, all of the slides that you will see, or not all of the slides, most of the slides have been generated with large language models. I have tried to ensure that the livelihood of no living author or artist is hurt by primarily choosing basically Albrecht Dürer or other 15th, 16th, and 17th century artists in the prompts in order to provide pictures that look good. So the fundamental argument of our book comes from a basic fact about the global economy, which is something which I think everybody who studies the global economy more or less recognizes, but not many people have really thought through how this works. And fundamentally, the idea here is that if we want to understand how the global economy works, we need to understand networks. And this is something that is really the underpinning of the globalized economic system that we still live in today. If you need to have goods being sold across different marketplaces, if you want to have various other forms of large-scale economic coordination, you need networks in order to be able to pull all of this together. And so these networks have traditionally, they've been viewed without huge amounts of interest by my colleagues in political science, because frankly, these networks sound extremely dull and boring. They sound like the plumbing of the global economy. So if you're looking at, for example, financial networks such as the SWIFT network, which allows for bank messaging to take place so that you can have international financial transactions. If you look at the internet, the plumbing of the internet, the TCP/IP stack, all of the things that are built on top of that. If you look at global supply chains, which involve all of these complex logistics, on the one hand, these things are important, but they also seem or at least have seemed until the relatively recent past, extremely dull and technical. And to the extent that they have any politics at all, these politics have seemed to be, how can I put it, very much pro-globalization, pro-free trade kinds of politics. And we see this, for example, in a really useful article, and when I say useful, I mean for people like me, rhetorically useful article that Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist and a writer of vast books that you used to be able to buy in airport bookstores when you actually bought books before you got on a transatlantic flight. Thomas Friedman had this article back in 1999 where he argued that these networks are going to transform global politics in a fundamentally positive direction. And so really what he wanted to do was he wanted to draw a contrast between the world of the Cold War, in which we saw countries divided by the Berlin Wall and by the broader wall, the Iron Curtain, between the countries of Western Europe and Eastern Europe, with, of course, Austria playing a very interesting role as the country in the West, which was in some ways perhaps closest to the East. So he wanted to draw a contrast between the divisions of that world and the new world economy, which he believed was going to be united, which he believed was going to be a single global economy, which would not have these walls. These walls would effectively be corroded by the vast rush of information, of commerce, of people buying and selling. And so he said that we lived in a world, as he put it, not of a wall, but of a web. And so here what he was trying to do, this was, of course, the era of Al Gore and people getting incredibly excited about the World Wide Web. He wanted to use the World Wide Web as a synecdoche for this broader transformation which was happening in world politics, where the past era of geopolitics, of great powers maneuvering against each other, was fundamentally going to be replaced by a world in which everybody would be woven together in this web of ceaseless and endless commerce, thriving activities, everybody cooperating and competing in the ways that liberal economists have wanted them to cooperate and to compete for centuries, but all without the state really having a role to intervene, beyond them sort of being supportive to business, being supportive to the private sector in doing what it wanted to do, and in weaving together this world which would be fundamentally, Friedman argued, would be fundamentally impervious to traditional geopolitics. Well, that was 25 years ago. We're now in the 25th anniversary of this piece, and we are in a world which is, to put it mildly, not the world that Thomas Friedman believed that we would be in. So this is a picture, obviously, which depicts the fights that are happening between the United States and China over semiconductors. This is a fight in which the United States is deploying its control of key aspects of semiconductor production, key aspects of semiconductor intellectual property, and is using this, is weaponizing this in a sense to deny China access to certain high-level semiconductors, NVIDIA A100s and others that are needed to train large AI models if you want to do this at a reasonable cost. And so this is, of course, the kind of thing which runs in a very, very antithetical direction to the kinds of things that Thomas Friedman suggested would happen. Instead of seeing these networks weaving the world together, we are seeing these networks, these supply chains in this particular instance, and the intellectual property relations which underlie the supply chains, we are seeing these relationships being used as weapons of geostrategic power and of geostrategic dominance. And this is not the world that we were supposed to have. This is a very different, much messier, and much more difficult world. And this is really what the book does. The book explains, it starts with the previous assumptions. It looks at people like Walter Wriston, this incredibly interesting businessman. He was the CEO of Citibank, who really, in many ways, was the architect of the ideas that Friedman and other people adopted later, and not only was a thinker, but was a doer. And we look at how the world that he created inadvertently gave way and provided opportunities for the kind of dominance by governments and by states that he had hoped would be insulated out of this new world order which was emerging. So why does this happen? How did we end up in this new world? Well, here I'm going to give you this is a graphic. It is a fairly hideous graphic. It is also not generated by a large language model. Those of you who have flown in the United States on Delta may even recognize what this graphic is. This is a route map of Delta Airlines. And what it does is it gives you a sense of what a hub and spoke network actually looks like. And this is how airlines do things in order to try and preserve some degree of efficiency. So that, say, for example, if you want to get from Mexico City to Bermuda, you're going to have to travel via Delta. You are almost certainly going to have to travel via Atlanta. Atlanta is a central hub in the network. And this central hub then, effectively, if Atlanta goes down, if there is a storm, if Atlanta Airport is closed for some reason, then that means that the entire Delta network effectively grinds to a halt. And so the fundamental point that you should get from this is that the networks that tie the global economy together, these financial networks, these supply chains, these information networks, very often, like the Delta Airlines map that you see here, they end up being hub and spoke networks. The internet notoriously was supposed to be a distributed network. That was supposed to be the design that the internet was supposed to have. In practice, however, for a series of reasons, and you can look at this in terms of business strategies, you can look at this in terms of preferential attachment, rich get richer models of the type that network mathematicians tend to be interested in. There are a bunch of different ways in which you can see these different things coming together, but these networks, which are supposed to be radically decentralized, instead ended up being highly centralized and ended up having nodes, central nodes in the network, which turned out to be choke points, which the entire network or much of the network then relied upon. And so this then gives us a very different understanding of what it is that the web that was holding the world network together actually involves. And here you see a better picture of what that web actually might be, with geopolitics lurking right at the center. Because crudely speaking, much of the argument that people like Friedman made relied on the assumption that the world was going to be flat, relied on the assumption that we were going to have a world in which these networks would not be centralized, so that, in the words of a famous old internet dictum that people like me are sufficiently old to remember, the internet was supposed to be a network where censorship would be recognized as damage and routed around, where there will be many, many different paths between any one destination and any other destination. But instead, if you have a centralized network, this provides an opportunity for geopolitics to re-emerge at the center of the web. If you are a government, if you are a powerful government, such as the government in many cases of the United States of America, and if you are able legally and practically to take control of one of these central choke points in the global economy, then you can exercise some pretty massive forms of global dominance. And this, more or less, is the story of the world as we describe it in the book. So that, first of all, you see the internet becoming a really a distributed surveillance system, because so much of internet traffic during the early 2000s travels across a small series of choke points which are located on US territory. There is a wonderful map that we found in the Edward Snowden leaks that really sort of shows this in a very visceral and graphic way. We also see this with regard to financial services. So we see how the so-called dollar clearing system, which is central to the global economy, allows the United States to press foreign banks into its service to isolate entire countries such as Iran from the global financial system. And we see it, as in the China versus US semiconductors case, we see how it is that choke points in global supply chains too can provide the opportunities for this kind of power politics. And the story of politics, of geoeconomics, as it's sometimes called today, is a story of how it is that we have seen over the last 20 years, the United States has played an extraordinarily dominant role. And now we are seeing a lot of pushback against it. We are seeing China, in particular, seeking to disentangle itself from the US web, while, of course, constructing slow and patient webs of its own. We see the limits of this when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war. There are a lot of other aspects which are playing out, but this is the world that we live in. And we just talk about this at great lengths. And one of the things that we talk about in the book, and I think this is what I would like to focus on, because this brings us back to some of the cybernetics that we were chatting about more informally at the beginning, is the kinds of problems that this creates for government as government tries to deal with this new world that it confronts. Because if you look at the old world of globalization, the Thomas Friedman world of globalization, that was a world in which a lot of the actual business of economics was put out to the private sector. More or less, the assumption was that business knew, for example, much more about supply chains than the government did. There were various reasons from people like Friedman and not Thomas Friedman, but Milton Friedman and Hayek, Friedrich von Hayek, which provided some intellectual justification for this. But this was a world in which the government more or less let the market and let the economy do what it did. The government withdrew from many areas of economic planning, which it had previously been engaged in during the 1960s, 1970s, and even up through the mid-1980s. Now we are in a world in which this economy suddenly is a source of new vulnerabilities, new security risks, and this means that government is piling back in again, but government is also finding that it is confronted with all of these challenges, with all of these difficulties that in actually sort of being able to adapt to this new world, which is not the world which it expected. So what do these challenges involve? Well, one is that if you look at how the US government, for example, has built itself up over time, if you look at the system that the United States, which is the most powerful actor in this world, actually created, it is not a particularly particularly effective system. It is a system which was designed in a rather haphazard way, in which rather than having any sort of global strategy, any plan for what it wanted to do, the United States more or less built up coercive capacities as it needed them. It took these steps, some sort of in order to do this or that thing in response to this or that perceived emergency, starting with September 11th. And then it discovered over time that these steps that it was taking sort of became a kind of a self-accumulating system, which didn't necessarily work. So that the things which were considered nearly inconceivable at one time then became conceivable, so that the ceilings of efforts in the early 2000s became the floor of new efforts in the late 2000s, creating this very, very haphazard governmental system in which the United States, for example, it is extraordinarily powerful, but it doesn't have the kinds of structures that it needs to really plan out what it ought to do. We also see, as a result of this, the United States has a system in which it has a lot of power, but it does not have the systems that it needs in order to think through how to apply that power in a very, very thoughtful fashion. So we have this the United States being increasingly willing to take very, very strong actions in the global economy with potential enormous risks. And this is one of the problems that I think the United States has faced when we look, for example, at the Ukraine-Russia actions and sanctions taken in global energy markets. The United States is facing a world in which it is trying to figure out how to apply these tools without having the structures that would provide the intelligence and the ability to do it well. And this requires building up expertise, which the United States doesn't have, and which the European Union, which of course has become much, much more directly engaged in these sanctions over the last sort of couple of years. The European Union is vastly behind the United States in its capacity to actually understand what it is doing. We see very, very little in the way of ability at the level of the member states actually to think through how sanctions should work strategically. We're seeing efforts at the level of the European Union itself, efforts in the European Commission, for example, to coordinate, but because of the way that the European Union is built, because it is really built around markets rather than national security, it lacks the ability that even the United States has to try and bring together economics and security in some kind of comprehensive package where it has a good understanding of what it's doing and where it has the tools that it needs in order to be able to act well in this new world. And this then finally leads to a new set of challenges, or a broader set of challenges at the level of the EU and the US, which is building institutions. We're seeing a lot of institution building happening in the United States at the moment. We're seeing, for example, sort of the building, in addition to the kinds of powers in the financial sector, in the information sector. We're seeing a lot of effort, for example, to build investment controls, to turn export controls into a system for controlling the economic and technological prospects of China. And this is going to lead, I think, over the next couple of years to a effort that is really going to accelerate. There is a Dalip Singh, who has just re-entered into the Biden administration as the Deputy National Security Advisor, is likely to sort of head up an effort to really do this stuff at scale. In the European Union, again, we're also seeing efforts to try and do this, but it is much more difficult to do because the member states do not want to give up control of their national authority over national security decisions. But this means that they tend to be rather divided and sometimes inept in their ability to actually get things done, to coordinate. And so this presents a new set of challenges that we face. So these are problems that are really going to be among the most important problems, I think, that face our understanding of the politics of technology over the next 10 to 15 years. A lot of debate in the European Union and in the United States is going to focus on this. And I think it is also going to have transformative consequences for many aspects of technology politics, which are of technology simply speaking, which have been regarded as being very, very distinct from national security in the past, are suddenly going to take on a national security patina or tone, which is going to really have, I think, some consequences for how we think about technology. And very obviously, I'm sure not all of these consequences are going to be good. We're going to see a lot of securitization, to use a technical word from the political science vocabulary, of issues which were previously not considered to have all that much to do with national security. And this has, I think, consequences for the ways in which people are going to live their lives, and for the ways in which the technological infrastructures upon which we all depend are thought about and are revived and are adapted to a world which is going to be considered as suddenly more dangerous. So how do we adapt to this world? Well, one thing that we need to do is we need to focus not just on the politics at the level of great powers such as the United States, not just at the internal politics of the European Union, but we need to look at global politics and think about multilateral politics more generally, because as already mentioned, a lot of this is really going to be driven by conflict between the United States and China. There is increased conflict, but what we haven't seen nearly as much of is together with this economic conflict, is the efforts by both sides to try to come together to figure out what might be some minimal rules of the road along the lines of what happened in the Cold War, in order to make sure that they have some mutual understanding, and they have some understanding of what the limits are to what each of them can do under these particular circumstances. So this is a important area where we have seen there are certainly quiet discussions happening in back rooms. There are not the kinds of open multilateral discussions that you might like, in order to try and build this, in order to mitigate these risks and prevent what really could be some very, very unfortunate problems from emerging. One of the books which I've read in the last couple of years, which I find most worrying, is a book by Nicholas Mulder. He's a Dutch historian working in the United States. He has this book called The Economic Weapon, which is about the period between World War I and World War II. And one of the claims that he makes, and he has got a lot of history to back this up, is that one of the reasons for World War II, one of the precipitating factors was the use of sanctions by the League of Nations during the World War I to World War II period, and the fears by non-democratic powers that sanctions would be employed against them, which gave them a further incentive towards territorial aggression, in order to be able to grab as much raw materials as possible before these raw materials were denied to them. So we need to figure out how it is that we can move forward to a better world, in order to try to prevent these kinds of dynamics from getting set in place, because such dynamics can lead in extremely unfortunate directions, especially when you consider the lack of trust that exists between the United States and China, and also when you consider, which is a secondary set of questions that we also talk about in the book, you consider the situation that the European Union has at the moment when it looks to the East, and when it considers Russia, which was seen 2 or 3 years ago as being a problem, but a problem that was more or less contained. And now we see a problem which is, I think, uncontained from the point of view of European politics, and where, again, there are many of these questions of interdependences which can be weaponized in ways that might be unfortunate, and where we have to think about how we figure this out going forward. So we have some arguments that we talk about in pieces in Foreign Affairs and other places which build upon the book. But really what this comes down to is, first of all, that policymakers really need to come to some better strategic understanding of the situation that they are in. They need to come up with a new set of ways of thinking about the world, new strategic concepts, new language, and probably over the longer term, new institutions that reflect this new world world, which is very, very different from the world of of globalization, from the world that Thomas Friedman depicted, but where we also don't want it to become a new version of the Cold War again. And there are forces building up, I think, especially in the United States and in Europe, which might very plausibly push in that direction. There's a lot of other things that I could say. I could talk about, again, I think that there are some interesting roles for old ideas such as cybernetics in thinking about how governments can respond more flexibly to these problems. But I think I'm just about at time right now, and I want to make sure that there is 30 minutes for questions and answers. So I will shut up and I will sort of turn over to the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Farrell, Henry. This is really to the heart of what we are often talking about, and also very challenging. I invite everybody to raise their hand if they have questions or to put it on chat. Let me take the privilege as moderator to pose the first question to you. Well, first of all, perhaps a comment. This kind of structural view that you take onto political, economic, and technological structures is actually very close, I think, to something that resonates with the computer scientists, the mathematicians, and the physicists here, and actually might be a bridging between disciplines. Let me see. A second thing that is perhaps interesting to know is that just yesterday, Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the World Trade Organization, proposed that Europe should put in place an economic security commissioner, and that there should be a council configuration. You know, the council configuration is that the member states are meeting at ministerial level, that there should be a council configuration on economic security, whatever that will lead to. But let me first go back to the beginning of your talk, because you talked about Friedman and the world is flat and all of that, and almost at the same time, I think it was in 1997, you got this book by Joseph Nye and Robert Crane and about power and independence. And later, Joseph Nye, who's a name in international relations studies, argued that there should be, there's much more room for soft power. Now, weaponization is much more about coercion, sanctions you already talked about, and export controls, and perhaps more severe forms of hard power rather than soft power. So I wanted to ask you, perhaps that was fitting well together, the time of Friedman and the time of Joseph Nye. Recently, I was in a seminar where Joseph Nye was being asked, so how is this about soft power, Joseph? And then he said, well, nowadays I would say I start as a realist and I aspire something better, which is almost like a slogan for a T-shirt. But I want to ask you, what is your view on this balance, hard power, soft power?
Okay, this is a really good question. And I should say briefly in response to the first 2 points you made, first, that a lot of this stuff is stolen pretty directly from, at least on my part, and so I can't speak for Abe, from my collaboration with a statistical physicist, which is where I started thinking about scale-free networks and their consequence in the first place. So if you look at weaponized interdependence, the article that this came from, you will see a lot of the, how could I put it, the clues as to where the body is buried can be found in footnotes, citations to computer science and to statistical physicists, of course, who've been thinking about large-scale networks for a long time. And secondly, with respect to the European Union, I think that this is, it's going to be very interesting because in a sense, this challenges fundamentally the way that the EU works, which is that the EU is built upon a division between economics and markets, which is at the EU level. Of course, the Commission, for example, has complete control over trade, and security, national security, which is at the level of the member state. And so the interesting thing for the proposals by Lamy and others is, to what extent does this lead to, if it works, to what extent does this lead to effective control over key national security issues leaking upwards to the EU, and what kinds of consequences will that have? I think that it probably has to happen. If you want this to work, the European Union does have to become more like a traditional state with control over national security on the EU level. But the politics through which that happens, I don't know, and I get very nervous. I sometimes think, when I'm optimistic, I think that about a statement from Charles Tilly that war makes the state and the state makes war. In other words, that where you see government coming together is under the pressure of fears about security and that this might happen in the EU. When I'm pessimistic, I think about the experience of Poland back in the 17th, 18th century, when it had effectively a unanimity decision requirement, the liberum veto, and the result was that Poland disappeared more or less for 150 years, and I would very much prefer the European Union not to disappear. So, sorry, that was longer than I should have taken, but response to Joe Nye. So one thing I should say is that Joe has been extremely kind, because if you read the original Weaponized Interdependence article that this came from, it was very specifically taking a wallop at Joe and Bob Keohane's work. So we were starting from their power and interdependence and saying there is something fundamental that this does not get. It argues that we are not going to see any concentration of network power, and if it does, we should not, we shouldn't be too concerned about it. It will all dissipate. Whereas in fact, we did see that concentration, and that concentration turned out to be extraordinarily consequential for national security. So despite this, both Joe and Bob, I think, have been extremely gracious in their response to this. And I think that in a sense, I think that the way that he says this, I think is plausibly absolutely right, which is that we need to start from this not necessarily in a completely hardcore realist way. So realists in international relations, of course, are the people who believe that everything is about military and security power. But I think we need to start from the perspective that we are in a world where security is at risk in ways which it wasn't, or at least didn't seem to be at risk in previous decades, and that has to shape our thinking. Equally, we don't want to necessarily end up in that world, because there are a lot of, how can I put it, self-perpetuating myths which become sort of realities because everybody believes in them if you slip too quickly into that. So I think where it comes to soft power, I think we, on the one hand, we need to recognize that this is a world of adversarial relations. I think singing Kumbaya with Vladimir Putin is not going to be a particularly effective solution to Europe's security problems. I think the Russia verstehers are rightly confined to a small, angry sector of the commentariat. You cannot, there are real security risks. Equally, I think that one has to try and work out modus vivendi and ways to live and ways to move forward with powers, including China, and to avert the risk of nuclear conflagration. So I think on the one hand, I think the realist perspective, which and when I say realist, of course, there are some realists such as notoriously John Mearsheimer, another international relations scholar, and Stephen Walt, who believe that we should not really be helping Ukraine. We should just recognize that Ukraine is part of Russia's sphere of influence. That seems to me to be, for a variety of reasons, quite wrong-headed. But we should also recognize that the best case scenario that we have 5 years from now is a Ukraine which has managed to perhaps gain much or all of the territory back, probably not all, but a substantial amount, but which is armed to the teeth, because one cannot trust that Russia is not going to do the same thing again. So I think so when it comes to soft power, I think that they're also, this is a huge part of the story, which I haven't mentioned at all, is, of course, the soft power of the United States and of democracy and, quote, liberalism in general, unquote, has diminished dramatically over the last several years for a variety of other reasons, to do with Donald Trump, to do with the difficulties that democratic systems have gotten into. Equally, I think that the the perception that countries such as China, systems such as China provided an alternative, that has taken some beating as well. So I guess if you were to think about soft power from not necessarily a realist perspective, but from a realistic perspective, I think that soft power in the world today stems from a degree of recognition of faults and flaws and efforts visibly and openly to address those flaws rather than from the somewhat jingoistic, somewhat innate assumptions of superiority perspective that I think soft power had perhaps during the 1980s, 1990s, when there was an assumption that there was just, or 1990s, 2000s, when there was an assumption that there was just one system and the world was necessarily going to converge towards it. I think soft power now has to stem from the understanding that persuasion is much more difficult. You cannot assume that you have a superior system, but that probably over the longer run, liberal democracy is probably going to produce the goods better than authoritarianism.
Okay.
And trying to build that out slowly, carefully, and with a recognition that this is also happening in a much more dangerous world.
Thank you, Henry, for a really interesting and extensive answer. Let's turn to Moshe, and then I think Edward Lee has a question that put on the chat, but perhaps you also want to pose that. So Moshe first.
Hi, Henry. Good to see you again.
Likewise.
There is a book you didn't mention, and I think it should have been mentioned, and it's the End of History, which was a bit earlier. I believe it was 1989.
Yes.
And I think this kind of reflect these books by Fukuyama and by Thomas Friedman reflects this belief that once the communist blocs collapse, or the Soviet bloc collapse, and China had its own reform, this is capitalism won, and liberal democracy won, and markets know best. And this is the approach that I would call as market fundamentalism. And we discover is that, yeah, market can be great, but they have their own, they have their own problems, and humanity is too complicated. We have something called history and culture and religion. And I think in some sense, to me, that decade of naivete ended up on September 11, 2001, when we realize there is more to the world than just markets. And to me, this somehow belief, if we just, for example, adding China to WTO, okay? Yeah, if they just come to trade with us, we'll sing Kumbaya. And this was a decade of naivety, and it's time to outgrow that naivety.
I think that's right. I think that's right. I think that we are, now I will say in fairness to Fukuyama, so I did a lot of reading of the literature of the 1990s. Fukuyama is the one that is still interesting. I think he is wrong on a lot of things, but is a much more subtle argument than I think people give sometimes credit for. And he does suggest that I'm sort of that in the end I'm sort of this post politics world may contain the seeds of its own destruction. He gets it wrong as to what these are, but it is it's less triumphalist, I think, than the Friedman version or many of the other versions that I have come across are. But I think that the fundamental point that you're raising here is absolutely spot on, which is that so that this faith in markets, and I think that there are two different versions of the faith. There's the Friedman version of the faith, which is really about efficiency. And so that markets are the most efficient ways for private individuals to achieve their means or achieve their ends given particular means. And then there's the Hayekian version, which is, of course, the version that suggests that we can't say that markets are efficient, but nonetheless, markets are far more capable of processing information than are other forms of planning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think, and this is something that I really would love to, I'm thinking about more and trying to organize something, putting something together in Santa Fe in a few weeks' time, Santa Fe Institute, which is around this. I think we're going to see some interesting convergence of almost a pincer movement on the supremacy of markets. One is what you raise, which is that trading with actors who are adversarial to us and have fundamentally different interests to us isn't necessarily always a bad idea, but it turns out to be at the very best much more complicated and much more fraught with risks than people assumed, in a world where they assumed that everything was just going to converge sooner or later on some kind of liberalism in the spectrum between Singapore and the United States. And on the other hand, I think we have the challenge that markets face from from a variety of forms of machine learning, which so I think are recreating the traditional ways in which we do economics in some weird and complicated ways. And Moshe, I know you know my co-author Cosma Schlitzy's work on this, which suggests more or less that you can't, you simply cannot approximate. I'm sort of using planning. Using planning, you cannot approximate the benefits that markets have. Equally, I think that we're seeing some strange hybrids beginning to emerge, and some areas of the economy in which I think trying to figure out what large language models are going to do for hierarchy and for how it is that governments and bureaucracies work. That is a whole interesting set of questions, and poses, I think, a second set of challenges to markets. That if governments need to intervene in the marketplace more for security reasons, and B, perhaps are able to develop better tools for so doing, then we may end up in a very, very different space than the space we've occupied for the last 30 or 40 years.
In the interest of time, and there are some more questions, let me hand over to Edward.
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, you mentioned large language models, and you also highlighted sort of the risks that are intrinsic when you get over centralization. And I was wondering if you wanted to comment on that, because the large language models also, pose real risks of accentuating the centralization. So, for example, taking over all the content moderation in public spaces. And I think, maybe you'd like to comment on what we could do to mitigate that risk.
It's here's my, and I'm trying to work this out in my head. So these are thoughts which I may repudiate in sort of in 2 months' time. But I kind of feel like we're in the world of sort of, to be a little crude, I'm sort of, after software eats the world, what comes out the other end? Which is to say that we're in a world in which large language models, they really are, they're technologies of summarization. They spit out these sort of weighted vectors, which are these very useful for some purposes, summaries of the relationships among words and these large corpuses of text. But of course, they also on the one hand, as you say, they could be used perhaps to try and moderate at scale. On the other hand, they are plausibly going to generate massive amounts of garbage. And from what I've read of the computer science literature, it'll be really interesting to see what happens. Do we get this garbage in, garbage out problem in a quite literal sense, when it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish large language model outputs? And here I'm assuming that watermarking schemes are going to be very difficult to implement in any comprehensive way. What happens to large language models at scale when large language models are producing both the inputs and the outputs? And my shorthand version of this is that I think that this leads to a world in which high quality human generated knowledge becomes actually substantially more valuable rather than less so than it has been in the past. And trying to figure out ways to generate that and to keep that clean, I think is going to be a important, but also perhaps an economically valuable and even an economically lucrative activity. So if I were betting a portfolio, I would be betting it on businesses that try to solve this problem rather than businesses that think that, oh my God, AGI is right around the corner and we are on the And anyway, I could go on for hours, but that's the basic nub of what I think about this. There are two pieces in The Economist, one together with Cosma and one which came out in December on Mark Andreessen's Techno-Optimist Manifesto, where I lay out these arguments, I won't say arguments, these efforts at quasi-intelligent hand-waving at slightly greater lengths.
Interesting. It would also be interesting to hear from Edward whether he agrees, but let's or your take on it. But let's first move to Hannes.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk, because now we have, let's say, Daron Acemoglu's talk on economy and also the impact of technology. And it's good to listen to you to see the impact of technology on geopolitics and this reciprocal relationship. I have one remark and one question. One is related to this, let's say, hierarchy of centralization, and maybe your comments to that, because we see a centralization on the network layer and the flow of information in this network, similar to your Delta network. But in the middle layer, we have a software which is highly decentralized, because the architect, let's say, the software philosophy of TCP/IP is a decentralized. Okay, there we have, because we have no central hub like that. But and then on top of that, we have this economic concentration again with the big five. So there we again have this centralized structure, and there I think also Edward Lee's notion comes in, because what we see now in the AI world is that it's also very highly centralized in the hands of those big five. So this is maybe one remark from my side, and the other one is related to Moshe questions, is the end of history, because you said something about the rules of the road, okay? And the rules of the road, the new ones will look into that we are going into a multipolar world. We don't have this, let's say, as it was foreseen in this end of history, we don't only have one economic centralized, let's say, very strong capitalist power, but now we have many different powers, and I think the rules of the road have to, let's say, respect that. And this is not so easy. What you see at the United Nations level, we see it on a lower level at the European level, but it might be easier than on the United Nations level. So what are your remarks to my two comments?
Okay, so I think the first one is really interesting, and I would have to think through, you can think about this as a decentralization, a centralization, decentralization sandwich, so where you have the two layers of bread, of centralized bread, and you have all of this squishy decentralization in the middle. And then I think the interesting question is, can you build out stuff from the TCP/IP stack that is in a certain sense decentralized again? And here, actually, the person who I think, so my sister is is writing a piece at the moment called "Rewilding the Internet," which is trying to think through how can you think about the internet from an ecological perspective, and so what kinds of ecologies do you want to build up? And I wonder whether, again, you might see something similar happening with sort of large language models, because on the one hand, they are, as you say, they are these intensely centralized sort of technologies, at least at the moment, sort of, in terms of, because of the amount of money that you have to spend in order to train them. But on the other hand, I think that the kinds of world that they are likely to create is a world in which there are going to be all of these these instantiations, these agents, which are competing with each other, creating a very, very messy and probably poisonous, in some respects, probably ecology. And here, I think about this, I'm sort of, and again, this is hand waving to some extent, as being like Amazon Marketplace writ large. So I don't know if you've poked around in the weirder parts of the Amazon Marketplace, but you see bots against bots. You see products that don't exist until until somebody hits the sort of the buy so you see all of these strange, weird ecologies being built up by these artificial agents, trying in effect to anticipate and to create demand, trying to manipulate each other. And so I wonder if we're going to see sort of around the sort of the central islands of control, which are the large language models themselves, we're going to see these sort of strange and sort of poisonous, somewhat toxic alien ecologies building up of agent against agent, sort of trying to sort of push back against each other. And so the second, what was your second question again?
The second was the rules of the road with a multipolar world. So we are not, let's say, end of history is over. So end of history. So
I think there's a real problem here, and so here's the really crude version of the problem as I see it. So you got informal rules of the road like the ones we are recommending emerging during the Cold War, thanks to people like Thomas Schelling and sort of articulating this logic via game theory, but also thanks to, I think, informal meetings happening over a number of years between people on the United States and Soviet side, where it really was it was nuclear scientists, strategists, and generals basically having dinner and drinking each other under the table, and gradually a set of informal norms and understandings emerge. You can do this, you can't do that, and it doesn't work hugely well, but it prevents some of the catastrophes that otherwise might have happened during the nuclear era from having emerged. And when we say rules of the road, I think what we're suggesting is that we would like to see a similar process happening where you would have informal conversations, hacking out the basic ideas, and then you turn it over to diplomats to try and create these formal diplomatic arrangements. But this is going to be vastly more difficult than it was back then. First of all, because there isn't just two powers. There are many other actors who are important players in the game. Secondly, because you cannot just look at this as being a problem for governments. This is a problem in which there are multitudes of different communities, whether they be in the information technology sector, whether this be in the physical sector. I mean, I was just reading a couple of days ago about cranes. Cranes have become a major source of worry, because of the information they provide about cargo being transported from point A to point B. So, crudely speaking, you have to figure out common understandings which reflect a vastly disparate set of national interests and of communities with different technologies, different understandings of how the technologies should work, but to somehow provide some minimal degree of sense as to what happens. And so I think we've got to try and do the best that we can. I think it is also going to be extremely difficult to do things that are better than minimal if we want to continue to preserve some aspect of the global economy and of the interdependence we've built up. So go ahead.
Can I have an add-on question? Because could academics play a crucial role, universities, because we have somehow a joint ground, a common ground with common, let's say, terminology and understanding, so we could bridge this disparate world?
And if I may add to that question, Hannes, was exactly what I had in mind. It's easier said than done for governments to change, having a background in government myself. How do you really bring them together in a different way of working? And so what can this academic community, for example, very diverse, rich, what can we as digital humanism academic community do?
So I think that to some extent you can do what you're doing at the moment, which is bringing together people who are who have deep technical knowledge with people who understand politics, with people who understand the humanities, and creating a minimal lingua franca among them so that people at least have some understanding of how the problems fit together is a useful start. I think that over the next coming years and decades, I would love to see computer scientists learning more about how geopolitics actually works. Equally, I think that people who study geopolitics need to acquire a deep and profound understanding of areas that have previously appeared to be too technical and too boring. So I think if there is a model, it is the informal relationships that exist between nuclear scientists and people who study national security and strategy. There clearly are communities there. So they talk together. They have some sense of. So if you are studying nuclear policy, you have to have some understanding of how the isotopes, how the isotopes get refined, so what the difference is between U-235 and U-236. If you don't have this, you aren't able to work. So trying to build those connections, which I think are really not very, very strong at the moment. I don't think that, and this is one of the things I try to do in DC, is to try and bring people together from these different communities so that they can at least have some understanding of the common language. But it's a vast, vast problem, which is going to require a huge amount of work. And Paul, I think that the European Commission, it has some extraordinary limits on what it can do, but it also has been quite good in the past at putting together broader communities. And so I wonder if, from your experience of European politics, if there is stuff that the Commission could do there in order to build up the kinds of expertise that it needs.
Yeah, I think we certainly are, in a sense, an optimistic, hopeful community. We are not subscribing necessarily to the hard, down, dark side of realism. And so it is picking up those opportunities and signals, and of course, people of this intent as you say, to work together on this. But it's intellectually very interesting, but also super challenging. We are approaching the end of this session, and something that is, I think, very kind of complementary to your great talk and answers will be your choice of the music, which I leave over to you. But for now, a virtual hand to you, Henry. Very much grateful, and thanks that we could be in discussion with you, and hope that you stay in contact with us. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I hand back to Peter or to Hannes.
No, we give it to Henry to explain why he has chosen this piece of music.
Well, I chose this
So,
piece
yeah.
of music because I'm interested in thinking forward about how governments can respond to this in cybernetics. And so this is composed partly by Brian Eno, who was appointed by Stafford Beer in a somewhat drunken way as his chosen heir for applying cybernetics to the world. Eno decided not to do this, but instead to make music, and very good music, but to apply cybernetic principles. So I thought that this would be a good and fitting piece of music. And also I like Brian Eno a lot, so that gives a good reason to do that as well.
Thank you. Fantastic. Let me, just before I play, announce the next event that we're going to have next week. And that is also in line with what you just said about, bridging political science with an understanding of computer science and getting computer scientists to know more about the world. So finally, we managed to find a date for the panel on educating future computer professionals to ethical and social impacts of digital technologies, which we had announced for the beginning of the year, had to postpone. Next week, it's going to take place on March 5th. And again, we will have this at 6 p.m. So mark your calendars here for 6 p.m. Until 7:30 Central European time, because we have a few speakers there, so we will take a bit longer. And Anna Bohn will moderate, and the panel will consist of Adele Bota, Rodrigo Ferreira, Dimkna O'Sullivan, and Bobby Schnabel. And so we will talk about this part here, how to bring this knowledge between, or distribute this knowledge between communities and disciplines. So thanks very much, Henry, and also thanks to Paul, and thanks to you all for joining. And without much further ado, Brian Eno, and also John Hopkins and Leo Abrams. John Hopkins, not to be mixed up with your affiliation, right, Henry? That's funny. This is like very close. All right. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next week then.
Goodbye.
Okay, I hope that was what you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Very good.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Thank you.